When you have this level of hostility and toxicity, hatred towards one another, it doesn't take much for the individual that's vulnerable and considering violence to decide, okay, now's the time to go do the violence. What's really hard is we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know where.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper, and I'm joined today by Russell Moore for a special episode to talk about the events of this weekend. An assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump took place this weekend in Pennsylvania. Joining us for this conversation is Elizabeth Newman. Elizabeth Newman is a national security expert, a violence prevention advocate, and author of the new book, Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Elizabeth, welcome to The Bulletin.
Thanks for having me.
Elizabeth, I'm curious, with your experience working in Homeland Security, what was your reaction to the news? How did you find out? And when something like this happens, what is the government doing?
I had just gotten home from running errands with my daughter and had come upstairs to do some household chores, bills, that kind of thing. And my husband came upstairs and was saying that his dad had called and they had been watching the rally and that Trump had fallen and something was happening. I was like, that's very weird. So we turned on the TV, and initially, I think because we were turning on right as it had happened, they didn't have the video feed yet. So it was just commentators filling airtime, and everybody was very cautious. They weren't sure if it was gunfire or if it was like fireworks. And so it took a few minutes to actually get the video. And then, of course, they were playing it on repeat. And I was sitting there looking for the counter sniper team. I was looking for people in the audience. I was looking to see if we had any obvious signs that somebody else had been shot. Regardless of your opinion of the politician, this is a major security failure and a tragedy for the American people. And so I just, on one hand, wasn't shocked because the data has been telling us for a long time that we're just a violent country and people believe that violence is justified to achieve their political agenda. And we have a lot of unhealthy people in this country who maybe aren't even ideologically motivated, who just see the way out of their pain to commit a mass attack like this. And so on one hand, not shocked, but also from an American perspective, from a human perspective, just deeply devastated. And shortly after we started seeing those videos, I got the call from ABC, had to go get ready to go on air. And I had to take a moment. I had to cry, get that out of my system so that I could go do the professional stuff. But I've been doing counterterrorism for 20 years. So you learn to be compartmentalized. But the first reaction is always one of deep emotion that this has happened. It's very devastating.
We're all in unison here that we're grateful that President Trump was not more seriously injured than he was. A family in the audience lost a father, a husband, a community lost a community leader in the one death that did take place, and two other people were more seriously injured. When you say the data is showing that we're moving towards a more and more violent place, what does that mean?
The past 10 years, we've been in ever increasing experiences of violence. And it depends on how you rack and stack, whether it's domestic violent extremism, we're at an all-time high. Each year surpasses the year before, and that's been going on for 10 years. If you're talking just targeted violence, which doesn't have an ideological motivation, pretty much the same. 2015 is the starting point. We started going up and we haven't stopped. If you don't look just at actual violent attacks, if you just look at cognitive opening to violence, we have 32% of Americans that believe violence is sometimes or always justified to achieve your political aim. That's 84 million people that are cognitively open to violence as the solution. And that statistic has been holding steady for about 3 or 4 years now. And then most recently, the Chicago Project on Security and Threats released a survey that they conducted last month that 10% of respondents said that the use of force was justified to prevent Trump from becoming president. And then 7% said the use of force was justified to return Trump to the presidency. So we have a total of 17% of Americans, that's about 44 million adults in this country, that believe violence is okay to achieve whatever they think the political outcome should be for the election cycle. We have 800,000 law enforcement officers in this country. We cannot deal with a threat of 44 million people. Now, most people do not mobilize to violence. It's a very, very small percentage that do. But in the modern era that we've taken statistics, we've never had this many people open to this suggestion that violence is necessary. And it's not just the big stuff. It's not only the mass attacks or the assassination attempts or attempts against a Supreme Court justice or the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband or the congressional baseball practice attack. Like, those are the ones that make the headlines. We are seeing violence all down the spectrum towards law enforcement officers, towards elected officials at local and state levels. There was a survey done by the Brennan Center that said 75% of public officials feel threats have increased in recent years, and a third of them reported personally experiencing abuse, harassment, or threats related to their public role. They're surveying people whose names you would never know unless they're in your local community. These are very low-level public servants who carry out the basic functions of our infrastructure and our day-to-day life. And they are experiencing unprecedented levels of threat and harassment. We're sitting on a powder keg and there are a bunch of people in the room smoking. There's not a path where you don't see violence. When you have this level of hostility and toxicity, hatred towards one another, it doesn't take much for the individual that's vulnerable and considering violence to decide, okay, now's the time to go do the violence. What's really hard is we don't know when, we don't know how, we don't know where.
Elizabeth, why is that? Is this because of a unique mental health situation in the United States right now? Is it because of interference from foreign enemies? We've had these periods of violence. You think of the 1960s, 1970s, but it's been a long time. I mean, we really didn't have a lot of talk about violently dealing with Bob Dole or Barack Obama or so forth. And so why now?
There are theories about cycles that societies go through, that periods of great uncertainty that cause kind of the before times to clash with the to be times. I do tend to think that we are in one of those moments where we're in the gray zone, the liminal age, passing from one way of living to another way of living. And when you go through that, violence historically is one of the things that we see in those moments. I suppose the good news there is that usually we come out of that and violence is not the norm on the other side. But I don't know that you can just assume that someday it will be okay. I think we have to proactively build the healthier, better future that we want that condemns violence and reestablishes norms of civility. But I take a little bit of hope that some of this is cyclical. Some of this is the product of going through pretty rapid change. But there is also no doubt that one of the biggest changes that we've experienced in the last 15 years is that of our technology and the way that we interact with one another, social media being a key contributor to our polarization, to anxiety and depression for girls, apathy for boys. We don't have data yet to draw this connection, but I do think it's not just happenstance that the timing of when we start to see the violence go up in the country around 2015 is also when we were past the tipping point of cell phones, having social media and having high-speed Wi-Fi through our cell phones. And we are always online now, and we have an entire generation who form their identity online. I think there's an aspect of a whole host of societal ills, and one of those downstream effects of a society that's not well is violence. So I don't know that security and law enforcement can fix what is inherently a much broader societal problem. But certainly when society as a whole is not healthy in the way that we're interacting with one another, in the way that we perceive ourselves in relationship to one another, one of those negative impacts is going to be an increase in violence.
It's certainly not constrained to the realm of U.S. politics. Rage seems to be informing a lot of what happens in our churches and denominations right now. Where do those parallels stack up, and what do you think is behind them?
If you look at the way the Christian theological tradition has talked about evil in terms of the world, the flesh, and the devil, all three of those parts are important. So you're dealing with a fallen universe. You're dealing with fallen human nature that historically has been violent and has turned violent very quickly. And then you're dealing with a unique sort of time. I'm concerned particularly about how this manifests in Christian context, which Elizabeth has written about in her very important book, Kingdom of Rage. But the way that we use concepts such as spiritual warfare to talk about other human beings, the way that we use apocalyptic language. This is an emergency situation. This is the tipping point that's going to decide everything. You've seen that in almost every attack of violence that we have had. And then I think we have to look at not just the big picture, but these small pictures as well. So you look at this shooter. We don't know a lot yet about motivations and so forth. What we do know that is consistent with what we've seen with other violent people is a marginalized, maybe even bullied sort of existence, isolation, disconnection. And one of the things that I think we see both with domestic terrorists and with international terrorists is this sense of finding identity and recognition and fame in notoriety, which is one of the reasons that Elizabeth and I have talked about this a lot about what happens when we sort of publicize the names and the writings of the people who do these sorts of things. There's a twisted kind of seeking for glory that often manifests itself in this way. And so it seems to me that the mental health crisis and the human sin problem and the time period are all converging here in some really dangerous ways.
Russell, in particular, what we know now about people that mobilize to violence, it's not really the ideology. It's not whether it's a Salafi jihadist ideology or a white supremacist ideology or anti-government extremism. It is underlying psychosocial factors that have gone unmet, primarily a need for significance and a need for belonging. You think about some of the broader mental health crises we know are occurring within Generation Z in particular, but not just Generation Z, older generations and the well-published studies on deaths of despair. We are increasingly a people who are having trouble finding our significance. We are disconnected from our neighbors, from meaningful relationships. And there are a lot of reasons why. It's not always intentional. It's just that is who we are as a people now. We're very alone. We're an individualistic culture already. And we are increasingly having difficulty finding meaning in life. And I don't think those are unconnected. Scripture tells us that part of our significance is in the body of Christ, right? Mm-hmm. There's an implication that we find significance in belonging to others. So when you remove belonging, your significance is also threatened. But it's more than just that. I think there's also a crisis of we identity seek through our phones, keeping up with some fantasy of what it means to be important and to somehow, therefore, you must have the amazing yacht and the private plane and an incredible career. And if you ask the average 12-year-old what they want to be when they grow up, they'll tell you an influencer. So we've created a generation of kids who have unreasonable expectations of what success is. And of course, as believers, we have answers for this. This is in part why I wrote the book, because the Christian community has the answer for where we find our significance and where we find our belonging. These very basic human needs that are in our generation so much more difficult to find through worldly means.
We know, obviously, most people who are sitting alone and isolated in the cafeteria are not going to become violent, they're not going to become shooters. But what sort of advice would you have to, say, a youth pastor or a youth leader or someone to say, here's how you should sort of intervene early before we get to this point?
It kind of depends on the circumstances. If you are dealing with somebody who is clinically depressed, the thing is to work with the parents and help them understand why it's really important to get their child help. And let's make sure to not ask our pastors to do things they're not trained to do. But well before you get to that place where they might be so beaten down by the realities of the world that they're in, if you're looking upstream, if you will, making it an intentional effort to check in on those kids that are more introverted, are more likely to spend time alone and see how they're doing. Just because you're introverted doesn't mean that you're at risk, but our society certainly tends to glorify the extroverts. So finding ways within church to provide connection to introverts is really important. Finding ways to encourage, if we can, parents to decrease screen time, educate parents, schools, and our churches that the screens are literally destroying the souls of our kids. And it's not just a oh, well, your kid might be struggling with anxiety. No, no. I personally believe this is leading to violence. I personally believe this is leading to death. And while the academics are still working to draw those connections, there's still enough out there about the damage to our children that we should not be handing them phones and social media at young ages. And let's debate what that proper age is. But right now, it's so ubiquitous that an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old is spending so much time online. It's just priming them in so many ways to be cognitively open to extremist messaging, to gang recruitment, to human trafficking. But in particular, it's that impact to their identity formation that most concerns me. That when we are forming our identity, going through that adolescent period, and it's being formed through social media, it's just so harmful. They need human interaction with their peers, with their parents, and with other adults that you trust as a parent. And that's where they need to be finding their identity formation. That's the reflection of God's image, not what's on Instagram.
The church gives us this incredible story to be a part of. It didn't start with us. It doesn't end with us. We have no reason to think it's going to be over in 10 years. It's an incredible antidote to despair in all kinds of ways. One of the things that comes with these cycles of history is the violence of the mob. And what the mob is hungry for is destruction. They don't care what they're destroying. Fundamentally, what is defining and driving the mob is just a spirit of discontent and rage that comes from that basic level of alienation. And part of the reason why we're a lonely culture is because we're a despairing culture, because we don't have better stories to tell anybody than the ones that get informed by our politics. And our politics live on a 2-year cycle, if that, to provide meaning and purpose. And then it starts all over again, because this midterm is the most important election of our lifetime until the next one in 2 years. That's a horrible way to live.
That point, Mike, about the mob is really important. I was reading the philosopher Rene Girard a couple of weeks ago about John 8, about the account of the woman caught in adultery. And there are all sorts of angles to that. But one of the ones he picks out is the way that Jesus pulled the mob apart with that statement, let you who is without sin cast the first stone. There are all sorts of implications there, but one of them being the first stone. And it sort of ended this way of absorbing oneself into the violence of a group and pulling each person out to say, you're standing here individually and personally. And I think that's an important part of this. It's just the isolation leads to, I've got to find myself somewhere. And it's often right now in an imaginary collective, which is the worst of both worlds.
It's one thing to talk about the violence that's happening as from individuals, from people who are taking things too far. But along with these specific instances, and Elizabeth, you named a number of them, how do we think about our political rhetoric? There was a piece in The Atlantic that came out just yesterday by David Frum talking about the assassin and the would-be dictator. And Frum, I think, does an interesting job of trying to differentiate and say, Donald Trump is not responsible for the actions of this would-be assassin who tried to kill him. This is a tragedy, full stop. This is evil, full stop. However, we can't look at this political moment and just ignore 8 years of violent rhetoric and incitement from Donald Trump that has shaped a lot of his political movement. And that piece was met with a lot of contempt from people on the right. This kind of contempt saying, how dare you suggest that Donald Trump's rhetoric has had anything to do with the escalation of violence in the last 8 years?
Frum's piece is technically accurate. It's not an opinion piece. What he is describing is actually backed up by lots of evidence at this point. We know that not just Trump, but others like him, when they use bullying rhetoric, harassing rhetoric, use language that suggests violence is appropriate, we actually see increases not only in online spaces of people calling for threats of violence, we actually see offline increases in hate crimes in particular. That's one of the more easy things for us to track. So there is a correlation between when we have influencers and politicians use that kind of rhetoric. And I would argue when Trump came on stage, he broke all the political norms. It used to be that a politician, if they said something inappropriate about the woman moderating a debate, that would be summarily condemned and they would apologize. And I shouldn't have said that. Like, he just broke the mold. He never apologizes. And somehow that made him more powerful. And it created this permission structure for people to do the things that in polite society we used to condemn. And that has consequences that go far beyond when Trump speaks. It's now others have permission structures to speak like him. And it leads to more people, all the way down to local officials, getting those threatening calls. And I want to be clear, like, some of these calls, I've met with some of these election or lower local officials, they get phone calls threatening their grandkids. I mean, these are people that like do this as their retirement job to keep them engaged in their local community. We're talking about small communities. To me, when you see it at that local of a level with a grandma that couldn't hurt a fly, having her grandkids threatened because somebody is absolutely convinced that they stole the election, what a disturbing place that we are as a country, that has somehow become acceptable ways of expressing your viewpoint. So Fromm is right. He owns this toxic soup that we're all swimming in. And yet, I think as believers, the first response is to help lead our people through grieving what happened on Saturday. There is time for debate and there's time for making our truth cases. But I think what we see, the model that Jesus uses, is that he starts with where the people are. And if your audience, or if you're trying to convince, whether it's on the right or the left, that, hey, we have a problem and we need to talk about it, you've got to let them grieve first. And then you can have a productive conversation. I don't know if we can ever get to the productive conversation because we stay in perpetual anger. But the reason we're in perpetual anger is because we never grieve. We're never given permission to really confess, like, I'm scared about this, or I'm really upset that this happened. Maybe it's to me personally, maybe it's to my group, maybe it's to the identity I find in this political movement. Whatever it is, we're never led in a way to just acknowledge the underlying emotions that are at play. The outrage and the anger is a surface emotion. It's not the real thing that's driving us. It's this other stuff. And we're living in fear, and we're living in deep despair, as you pointed out, Mike. The thing that the country needs is calling that out so that we can grieve, and then we can have a constructive dialogue. Now, I'm not Pollyanna here. I don't see that there's anybody well positioned to lead us in that way, but I do think within our own churches, we can do that. And I do think within various ministries, like what Christianity Today does, there's the opportunity to lead people in that. But I do think that's the mistake, is that trying to have a constructive conversation with people that are angry usually doesn't work. You have to wait for the anger to pass before you can have constructive dialogue. While it's really easy to be destructive at a national level, you can't rebuild at a national level. It is at the grassroots that our strength comes from. So you want to do something to heal the country, focus locally. And then two, I would tell you, if you really get upset about national politics and, oh no, it's going to affect your life, as a Homeland Security official, it is way more important who you put in office in your local mayor's office, your local county's office, your state office. Those people, if they are not competent and have good character, on the bad day, when the hurricane comes, when the tornado comes, when the fire comes, when the flood comes, your family won't be rescued. And we've seen this happen in America. We've seen this happen, devastating consequences during Hurricane Katrina, because a board that probably nobody knew existed, that is elected by the local people of New Orleans, fraudulently stole funds and didn't repair levees. And thousands of people died because of that. So your local vote has way more impact on your day-to-day life than your national vote.
Russell, I'd love to hear you talk about this. Where is the line between politicians using political rhetoric that's meant to motivate and activate their people, and then the line where it becomes incitement. One of the things that we've heard a lot related to this, Republicans in particular right now are pointing to the fact that Biden has said over and over again, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And I'll put my cards on the table and say, I think that when a candidate says he wants to be dictator for a day, that is a threat to democracy. That's a problem. Like, that's a truthful statement.
Yeah.
I also think the idea that Donald Trump is Hitler, that Donald Trump is a fascist, is the kind of rhetoric that's stretching beyond where we are. It communicates a faithlessness in democracy as a whole that I'm not entirely convinced is helpful. How should Christians be listening to that? And where do politicians become morally responsible when crowds take things too far, when the mob shows up and says, yeah, he is a threat, we should take him out?
One of the ways we do that is look at how it's been done well and poorly in American history. Go back and read. There's a little Library of America volume on the selected speeches of Lincoln, and the way that Lincoln is dealing with a genuine threat to democracy, to the Union, and insurrection against the United States of America speaks very clearly and directly to that, and yet is pointing people toward a day of ultimate reconciliation. We have seen that over and over again, even in terms of not just our internal issues, but in terms of polemic directed toward international enemies. You think of the way that Reagan speaks very directly. Soviet Union is an evil empire. Soviet Union is intent upon national domination, and then would speak to the captive people in Poland and the USSR and East Berlin and other places in a way that points them toward a hopeful and reunited kind of future, as opposed to the demagogues that we have said, the Theodore Bilbos, the George Wallaces, the Huey Longs, those sorts of examples over American history that we're embarrassed by later. We can start to get our grounding in thinking through those things. And then beyond that, I think when it comes to the political, the problem is we want to take eschatological judgment categories. Ultimate victory, you think of the old hymn, till every foe is vanquished and Christ is Lord indeed, separation of sheep and goats. And we apply it to the running of a country and to politics in a way that people assume if we just get through this next moment, then they will be gone and we will have won. Yuval Levin has a new book on the Constitution called American Covenant, where he talks about this Carl Schmitt language of friends versus enemies. And says people who are common citizens of a country are friends. That doesn't mean that you don't use polemics against each other. It doesn't mean that you have this sort of false kind of civility. It means that you ultimately know when we get through this, we're both still going to be here. And so we're going to have to live with each other and find ways to persuade each other. When that's absent, and there's this imaginary sort of video game that pretends that won't be there, that's when I think we're in real danger.
Yeah, it reminds me of something Jonah Goldberg says all the time, this idea that one of America's addictions is to this idea that the American project and that democracy itself is about unity. It's not about unity. Mm-hmm. It's about disagreement and how we hammer that out. When you have utopian promises at the heart of political conversations, that has to feed despair. And it has to drive people to go, well, it hasn't worked doing it this way, so now we have to do it.
Yeah, the definition of worked is wrong.
Where are things headed from here?
One of the things that I've been hammering on for the last year and a half is saying to people 2024 is not just a replay of 2020 and 2016. We don't know what's going to happen, and events are going to change very, very, very quickly. And every time it seems that, oh, well, everything is now on a path that we can track and we know where it's going, that has not been true. And so I think we need to be expecting anything over the next several months.
I will answer the question primarily from a security perspective. I think that the threat environment that we're in is the most complex I've seen in my entire career. And that's saying something since I started right after 9/11. It is complicated by the fact that the threat vectors are multiple. We have nation states like Russia that are intent on interfering in our elections. They've been at it for at least 2 cycles, and all the evidence shows that they are up to it again. There are other countries that have followed suit. We have a resurgence of ISIS-K, who has demonstrated the capability of conducting external attacks, at least in Russia and other places. There is some threat intelligence that NBC News has reported that they have been able to smuggle people into the United States through the southern border. It appears that the individuals they smuggled in were arrested, but it is not a great threat picture from the overseas perspective. And then you add to it everything that we've just been talking about, the political rhetoric. We still have organized violent extremist groups within the United States that are regrouping. They kind of went quiet after January 6th because the FBI was investigating more. We are seeing them regroup, recruit, and they're pretty active in conducting what is primarily First Amendment protected activities, protests, and spewing hateful rhetoric, but all of which is protected by the First Amendment. So you have a number of groups out there that are looking to take advantage of the chaos of our politics and seeking to divide us further, seeking to weaken us as a society. And that tells me that we're in for some dark days ahead. Usually when you have the kind of toxic soup that we've been swimming in, we do see violence. And I do think that we'll see more violence in the coming months ahead.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you on Friday.
The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.